Imagine this. You're sitting in a room full of people, friends, family, co-workers. The air is filled with conversation, laughter, and easy exchanges of words that seem to glide effortlessly between them. But when you speak, something shifts. The energy changes, if only slightly. Your words land differently, met with puzzled expressions, a hesitant nod, or an abrupt change of subject. It's subtle, but you feel it. They don't get it. At first you wonder if you just phrased it wrong, so you adjust. You try again, simplifying, shaping your thoughts to fit into something more digestible. Still, it happens. The blank stares. The way someone else reinterprets what you said, twisting its meaning into something far shallower than you intended. The way your silence is more comfortable to them than your words. And then it dawns on you, this isn't about phrasing. It's not about how you say it. It's about something deeper, something more isolating. They don't see the world the way you do. You walk through life with thoughts that stretch beyond the surface, feelings too deep to summarize in small talk, perspectives too intricate to be captured in a passing comment. But the world thrives on simplicity, on categories and labels that can be easily processed. You are not simple. You do not fit. So what happens? You begin to shrink. Not physically, but inwardly. You edit yourself. You hold back the thoughts that once excited you. You nod along to ideas you don't believe in. You become an actor in your own life, playing the role of someone more palatable, someone who fits the script. And yet, despite your best efforts, something lingers an ache, a quiet sense of alienation, a feeling that no matter what you say or do, no one truly sees you. What is more painful, being alone or feeling alone in the presence of others? It's a paradox that haunts those who feel deeply, who think beyond the obvious, who perceive reality through a lens that is not shared by the majority. To exist in a world that does not understand you is to live in exile while being surrounded by people. It is to shout across an unbridgeable distance, knowing that no matter how loud your voice, it will reach no one in the way you intended. But why does this happen? Why do some minds seem to exist on an entirely different frequency from the rest of the world? Is it intelligence? Is it sensitivity? Or is it something more tragic, something embedded deep in the structure of society, of human psychology itself? The answer is not as simple as we might hope. And the consequences of this phenomenon are far more insidious than we might realize. Because here's the real question. What happens to a person when they go through life being misunderstood? And more terrifyingly, what happens when they start to believe that no one ever will understand them? But why does this happen? Why do some people feel as though they exist on a different frequency, unheard, unseen, fundamentally alien in a world that claims to celebrate individuality? The answer is not simple because the problem itself is not simple. It is not just a matter of intelligence or depth or sensitivity. It is something deeper, something woven into the very nature of human interaction. To understand the pain of being misunderstood, we must first understand the human mind itself. Human beings are pattern-seeking creatures. Our brains are wired to categorize, to simplify, to reduce complexity into digestible pieces. This is not a flaw, it is a survival mechanism. In a world overloaded with information, we cannot afford to deeply analyze every person we meet, every sentence we hear, every idea we encounter. And so, we rely on shortcuts, stereotypes, labels, familiar narratives. We do not listen to understand, we listen. Is this person like me or not? Is this idea something I already know, or is it a threat to my worldview? This is why being misunderstood is so common. It is not because people are unwilling to understand, but because true understanding requires effort. And effort, in an age of distractions and shallow interactions, is a rare commodity. The moment someone speaks in a way that does not fit an existing category, the mind resists. It seeks to reshape the words into something familiar, something easier to process. But in doing so, it distorts. And when this happens repeatedly, when your words, your emotions, your very existence are continually misinterpreted, you begin to feel as though you are speaking in a language no one else can hear. This is not just an illusion, it is a documented psychological phenomenon. Cognitive biases like the false consensus effect, where people assume that others think the same way they do, make it difficult for them to grasp perspectives that differ from their own. The curse of knowledge, where those who understand something struggle to remember what it's like not to understand, creates an invisible barrier between those who see and those who don't. A society where those who think differently are often reduced to simple misunderstandings, written off as too complicated, too deep, or even too sensitive. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote, "It is always consoling to think of suicide. In that way, one gets through many a bad night." He did not say this to glorify despair, but to highlight the depth of existential isolation, the feeling of standing alone in a world that does not understand you. Nietzsche, like many great thinkers, saw that to think deeply is to risk alienation. To see beyond the surface is to bear the weight of knowledge that others do not share. And to exist in that space, to hold ideas, emotions, and truths that the majority cannot or will not acknowledge, is to experience a loneliness that cannot be easily remedied. Jean-Paul Sartre took it further, arguing that misunderstanding is not just an accident, it is a fundamental part of human existence. His concept of the other suggests that we are not seen as we truly are, but as others imagine us to be. You are not a person to them. You are a projection, a reflection of their assumptions, their biases, their incomplete understanding. And so, even when we believe we are being understood, we are not. We are merely being assigned a role in someone else's narrative. This is the hidden problem. Not just that we are misunderstood, but that true understanding may be impossible. When a person is constantly misunderstood, they begin to change. Some rebel, growing louder, more forceful, demanding to be seen. But the world does not reward those who insist on being difficult to categorize. It ignores them, silences them, labels them as difficult or arrogant. They begin to doubt themselves. They ask, if no one understands me, does that mean I am the problem? They begin to dilute themselves, simplifying their thoughts, suppressing their emotions, choosing silence over expression. But here is the real danger. What happens when you hide yourself for too long? Do you still exist in the way you once did? Or do you become nothing more than the version of yourself that the world allows to be seen? The more you suppress, the more you forget what was once there. And eventually, the pain of being misunderstood is replaced by something worse. The pain of no longer knowing who you are. And yet, the consequences of this go even deeper. Because this problem is not just personal, it is societal. A world that does not understand its deepest thinkers, its most introspective souls, is a world that slowly loses its capacity for depth altogether. What happens to a society that rewards shallowness and punishes depth? And what happens when those who once saw the truth stop trying to share it? Imagine a world where no one truly hears you. Not because you are silent, but because your voice, your thoughts, your very essence are filtered through the distorted lens of others' perceptions. Now imagine living in that world for years, decades even. What happens to a person when they are continuously misinterpreted? The answer is far more disturbing than simple loneliness. Being misunderstood is not just an inconvenience. It is a slow erosion of identity. It shapes the way you see yourself, the way you interact with the world, and eventually, the way you exist. The silent war inside. At first, you fight. You try to explain yourself. You reach for metaphors, examples, anything that will bridge the gap between what you mean and what they hear. You modify your language, soften your tone, and suppress the parts of yourself that seem to cause the most confusion. But nothing changes. The misinterpretations persist. The labels stick. The weight of being reduced to something smaller than you becomes unbearable. So the war turns inward. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance, the psychological discomfort that arises when there is a conflict between how you see yourself and how the world sees you. When this dissonance is too great, the mind has only two choices: either continue fighting, exhausting yourself in an endless struggle to be understood, or surrender. And surrender is the path most people take, not because they are weak, but because it is the only way to survive. You begin to edit yourself, stripping away the parts of you that do not fit. You speak less, or when you do, you say what is expected rather than what is true. Over time, your inner world, the thoughts, emotions, and ideas that once made you unique, begins to shrink. But here is the real tragedy. After long enough, you no longer need external misunderstanding. You begin to misunderstand yourself. Carl Jung warned of this phenomenon. He spoke of the persona, the social mask we wear to fit into society. While some degree of adaptation is necessary, Jung argued that when a person's true self is ignored for too long, the mask ceases to be a disguise. It becomes the only identity left. You no longer express yourself freely because you no longer know what your true self wants to say. You no longer push back against misinterpretations because you have started to believe them. And this is how the misunderstood become invisible, not because they are unseen by others, but because they have lost sight of themselves. But what about the world? What happens to a society that continuously misreads its most complex minds? Look at the great thinkers of the past, the philosophers, the writers, the artists. Many of them were ridiculed, ostracized, dismissed as mad or dangerous in their time. Nietzsche, whose ideas later reshaped entire schools of thought, died alone, considered insane. Vincent van Gogh, whose paintings are now priceless, was seen as unstable, his genius overlooked until long after his death. Society does not immediately recognize depth. It does not reward those who challenge its illusions. Instead, it isolates them, forcing them into exile, sometimes physically, but more often mentally and emotionally. And so, the world loses something precious. It loses innovation, because those who think differently are discouraged from sharing their ideas. It loses depth, because those who see beyond the surface are pressured to conform. It loses wisdom, because those who speak inconvenient truths are ignored until it is too late. The cycle continues generation after generation. And the question remains, how many voices have been silenced before they could change the world? When a person is misunderstood for too long, when they feel unheard, unseen, and reduced to something lesser than they are, a shift happens. Some fall into despair, withdrawing completely, resigning themselves to a life of quiet suffering. But others become something else entirely. They become resentful. They stop trying to connect. They stop seeking understanding. Instead, they embrace alienation, viewing the world as something hostile, something undeserving of their truth. And this is dangerous. Many of history's most destructive figures were deeply misunderstood souls who turned their isolation into bitterness. When the world continuously refuses to see someone as they are, there is always the risk that they will stop caring about the world altogether. This is why misunderstanding is not a trivial problem. It is not just a personal struggle, it is a societal risk. When those who see beyond the surface are dismissed, when depth is treated as a burden rather than a gift, the world does not just lose individual voices, it loses vision, it loses progress, it loses the ability to truly evolve. So the question becomes, is there a way out? Is there a way to exist in a world that does not understand you without losing yourself in the process? There is. but it requires something radical, something that most people are too afraid to attempt. What if the real tragedy of being misunderstood is not that others fail to see you, but that you have spent so much time waiting for them to? What if freedom is not found in forcing people to understand, but in realizing that their understanding is not required for you to exist fully? The greatest rebellion is not loud. It is not about convincing, proving, or demanding to be heard. The greatest rebellion is to live as you are, unapologetically, despite the world's inability to comprehend you. But how? How does one reclaim their truth after years of being misread, mislabeled, and dismissed? Step 1. Abandon the need for validation. At some point, you must ask yourself, what would I do differently if I no longer cared about being understood? This is a terrifying question because so much of human behavior is built around the desire for connection, for recognition, for approval. But the moment you stop waiting for the world to get you, you begin to move freely. Carl Jung understood this well. He argued that true individuation, the process of becoming your most authentic self, requires detaching from the need for collective approval. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, he wrote. This means speaking even when no one understands, creating even when no one appreciates, and thinking even when your ideas are dismissed. It means acting not to be seen, but simply because it is what your soul demands. It is a form of existential rebellion, refusing to be diluted for the sake of comfort, yours or anyone else's. Step 2. Redefine what it means to be heard. Perhaps the problem is not that no one understands you, but that you have been searching for understanding in the wrong places. History is filled with figures whose ideas were rejected in their time but changed the world later. Kafka died believing he was a failure. Emily Dickinson's genius was recognized only posthumously. Socrates was sentenced to death for thinking differently. What they had in common was this: they did not stop. They did not wait for the world to catch up before they expressed what they knew to be true. They spoke, they wrote, they created, not because they sought immediate recognition, but because their ideas deserved to exist. If you feel deeply misunderstood, perhaps you are simply speaking to the wrong audience. Seek those who listen, not necessarily those who agree, but those willing to engage. True understanding is rare, but it does exist. And in a world of billions, there are minds who will resonate with yours. Step 3. Build strength from isolation. Nietzsche believed that isolation was not a curse, but a necessity for those who wish to think deeply. At times, one remains faithful to a cause only because its opponents do not cease to be insipid, he wrote. The pain of being misunderstood is real, but it can also be the birthplace of something greater: self-reliance, intellectual courage, and the ability to think without fear. What if, instead of seeing loneliness as a punishment, you viewed it as preparation? The greatest thinkers, creators, and revolutionaries were often alone, not because they were unworthy of connection. Perhaps your solitude is not evidence of your failure to connect, but proof that you are standing on the edge of something others have yet to see. Step 4. Speak in your own language, not theirs. One of the biggest mistakes of the misunderstood is trying to fit themselves into the language of the majority. They simplify their thoughts, water down their emotions, compress their depth into something more digestible. But in doing so, they betray themselves. The world does not need another echo. It needs originality. Dostoevsky, whose novels explored the darkest corners of the human soul, did not simplify his work to be more palatable. Jung, whose theories about the unconscious were considered radical, did not dilute his ideas to gain mass appeal. They spoke in their own language, and in time, the world learned to listen. You do not need to conform for the sake of being understood. Speak in a way that is true to you, and let those who are meant to hear it find you. What if the very thing you have spent your life resenting, the struggle of being different, of being unseen, was actually your greatest strength? What if the pain of being misunderstood was not a burden, but a sign that you are touching upon truths that others have not yet reached? Great ideas, great art, and great revolutions are often born from those who refuse to be limited by the world's inability to understand them. Maybe the goal is not to be understood, but to be undeniable. Have you ever paused long enough to ask yourself, what if the misunderstanding you've been trying to escape was never the problem at all? What if the pain you've carried for so long, the weight of being misunderstood, was actually a gateway to something much deeper? The most profound realizations often come when we least expect them. When the struggle to be understood seems endless, when the isolation feels like a prison, there is a strange and radical truth waiting on the other side, a truth that could change everything. What if the very thing you've been fighting, the alienation, the loneliness, the frustration of not being seen, is actually a blessing in disguise? It seems paradoxical, but the truth is this: being misunderstood, when viewed from a higher perspective, is not a burden. It is a gift. The pain of being misunderstood has a purpose. It forces you to look inward, to ask deeper questions about who you are and why you think the way you do. It pushes you to define yourself without relying on the perceptions of others. It strips away the superficial layers that society places upon us and forces us to confront our raw essence, our true selves. In this sense, misunderstanding is the crucible in which your identity is forged. The very discomfort it causes is what gives birth to a stronger, more resilient version of you, one that no longer depends on external validation to feel whole. It forces you to ask the most profound question of all: who am I when no one is watching? When the eyes of others are not upon you, when you are not required to perform for anyone, do you still know who you are? There is a deeper truth that only the misunderstood truly understand. We are all, in some sense, misunderstood. No matter how much we try to explain ourselves, no matter how carefully we craft our words, the truth is that human understanding is always partial, always limited. Each person filters the world through their own experiences, biases, and limitations. Therefore, complete understanding between individuals is impossible. This is a humbling realization. But it is also freeing. When you stop seeking total understanding, you begin to see that the pain of being misunderstood is not a reflection of your inadequacy. It is simply a reflection of the inherent limits of human connection. We can never truly understand another person in their entirety. All we can do is attempt to glimpse fragments of their soul. Once you accept this, the sting of being misunderstood begins to fade. Instead of seeing it as a failure, you start to see it as a natural part of the human condition. Misunderstanding is a part of life, an inescapable byproduct of our unique perspectives, and here lies the power of this realization. When you stop expecting the world to fully understand you, you free yourself from the prison of external judgment. You no longer need the world's approval because you realize that its perception of you is inherently flawed. In accepting misunderstanding as a natural part of the human experience, you come to a profound conclusion. Your true self is not defined by the world's perception of you. Your value is not contingent upon others seeing you clearly. Your worth is intrinsic, woven into the very fabric of your being. Once you fully internalize this, you will no longer seek validation from a world that cannot and will not fully understand you. This is the final breakthrough. The ultimate truth that frees you from the pain of misunderstanding is the realization that you have always been whole. You have always been enough. It is not the world's approval that gives you value, but your own recognition of your inherent worth. And now, as you stand on the precipice of this realization, you must ask, what will you do with this new freedom? Will you continue to shape yourself based on the world's broken understanding? Or will you begin to define yourself on your own terms? Will you continue to shrink, waiting for others to see you? Or will you expand, embracing the fullness of who you are, regardless of how others perceive you? This is where the real transformation occurs, not in the moment of being understood, but in the moment you stop needing to be. You can choose to live authentically, to speak your truth, to embrace your deepest self without concern for whether others comprehend it. This is the essence of freedom, to live unapologetically without the chains of misperception. When you embrace this truth, the world begins to change, not because others see you differently, but because you see the world differently. You no longer view misunderstanding as a personal attack, but as a natural, even inevitable, part of human interaction. You no longer expect the world to mirror your inner reality, but rather, you learn to navigate the world on your own terms, with confidence and clarity. This shift does not require the world to change. It requires you to change. And in that change, you become liberated. The misunderstood are not weak. They are the visionaries, the outliers, the ones who carry the potential for transformation. They are the ones who dare to think differently, to challenge the status quo, and to live authentically regardless of whether anyone understands them. A final thought. Now, as you reflect on everything you have learned, ask yourself, do you want to remain bound by the world's limited perceptions? Or are you ready to break free and claim your true identity? The world will never fully understand you, and that is not only okay, it is necessary. For in the space of misunderstanding, you will find your truest self. And that self, free from the expectations and distortions of the outside world, will become a force to be reckoned with. So go ahead. Step into the world as the misunderstood, as the misperceived. For you are not broken, and you are not lost. You are just waiting to be fully seen by the only person who truly matters, yourself.